The federal government did not fund more than $150 million in flood mitigation projects sought by state and territory governments, including a priority upgrade to Queensland's early flood warning infrastructure. Key points. The federal government's first round of funding for the National Flood Mitigation Infrastructure Project in 2020 was capped at $50 million. The federal government's first round of funding for the National Flood Mitigation Infrastructure Project in 2020 was capped at $50 million. Queensland applied for funding for 20 projects, 5 of which it said were a priority, and the federal government funded 3. Queensland applied for funding for 20 projects, 5 of which it said were a priority, and the federal government funded 3. The government has not been allocating up to the maximum $200 million each year it can draw from the Emergency Response Fund. 7.30 can reveal that state and territory governments across Australia applied for just over $217 million in funding for projects during the first round of the federal government's National Flood Mitigation Infrastructure Project in 2020, which is drawn from the $4 billion Emergency Response Fund. A spokesman for the Queensland Reconstruction Agency told 7.30 the Queensland government had raised concerns with the federal government about the speed of release of funds under the program, consultation with the states and the consideration given to priority projects. The government's first round was capped at $50 million. While a capped total of $200 million can be allocated each year from the Emergency Response Fund, the government disputes it would have been able to fund other flood mitigation projects under the remaining $150 million. The Queensland state government applied for more than $127 million for 20 separate projects after the funding round was announced in November 2020. Queensland is the most disaster-affected state in the country and has experienced more than 80 natural disasters over the last decade. While a review panel recommends which projects to fund, the Emergency Management Minister has the discretion to award funding. 7.30 can reveal the Queensland government identified 5 of those projects as priority funding, which they were required to do under the grant guidelines. Those priority projects included a $14 million upgrade to the flood warning infrastructure network. That funding was sought to roll out new and upgraded infrastructure to improve flood warning services in South and Southwest Queensland, as well as other local government areas in North Queensland. In a May 2021 announcement, the federal government elected to fund 3 of the projects in Queensland. That included $5.7 million for the Dutton Street Bridge in Ingham, $3.3 million for Floraville Road upgrades, and $793,339 for the Armstrong Creek Causeway. The Dutton Street upgrade was the only approved project flagged as a priority by the Queensland government. The flood warning infrastructure project was not included. A spokesman for the Queensland Reconstruction Agency told 7.30 Queensland ranked its applications based on critical impact to people and public safety. The Commonwealth did not provide detailed advice as to why the approved projects were selected. The Queensland government has raised concerns over the speed of the release of National Flood Mitigation Program funding, the lack of consultation with states, and that the state priorities do not appear to have been considered. Shadow Emergency Response Minister Murray is questioning how the government selected which flood mitigation projects to fund and its decision not to allocate more funding given the volume of funding requests. Got a confidential news tip? Contact Paul Farrell using the Signal Secure messaging app on +614 6835 0519 or at Paul Farrell 1 Proton Mail. Shadow Emergency Management Minister Murray says there are questions over how the projects were selected for funding. Many of the projects that were funded through the Flood Mitigation Program are very worthy projects, he told 7.30. But, as we can see, there are some other really important projects that could have made a really big difference that missed out. If the government had been prepared to allocate all of that funding towards disaster mitigation, it could have actually funded every single one of those projects. Emergency Management Minister Bridget McKenzie told 7.30 in a statement the National Recovery and Resilience Agency had advised her that the National Flood Mitigation Infrastructure Program was for Pre-Disaster Flood Mitigation Project S and could not be funded from the $150 million post-disaster recovery component of the EIF, as this would not be lawful expenditure under the EIF Act or the Public Governance, Performance and Accountability Act. The legislation is prescriptive about the use of the $150 million post-disaster recovery component of the EIF, as this would not be lawful expenditure under the EIF Act or the PGPA Act. In the event that a community is catastrophically impacted by a natural disaster, the government will have access to a maximum of $150 million per year to fund recovery measures. She said that in reviewing and assessing applications, some projects were deemed ineligible against the criteria outlined in the program guidelines. The flood warning infrastructure in Queensland has previously received $8 million in joint Commonwealth and Queensland government funding through the disaster recovery funding arrangements. The 2020 request for funding was for areas of Queensland not covered under those earlier funding requests. A second $50 million round of funding under the National Flood Mitigation Program has also recently closed. A spokesman for the Queensland Recovery Agency said, "The scope of the network improvements is based on network investment plans developed by QRA in collaboration with local governments, which identify priority locations across Queensland to inform investment in new or upgraded flood warning infrastructure." Funding for QRA's proposal for the Flood Warning Infrastructure Program under the National Flood Mitigation Infrastructure Program would have covered the implementation of network improvements for the remaining part of the state. Questions over how projects were chosen for funding. The Commonwealth government often provides financial support in the aftermath of disasters. Most other states and territories received only part of the funding they had sought during the 2020 flood mitigation round, and none applied for the extent of funding that was sought by the Queensland government. The New South Wales government applied for $17.3 million in funding for 8 projects. The federal government decided to fund 7 projects, for a total of $13.3 million. The Victorian government applied for $9.8 million in funding for 4 projects. The federal government funded 3 of the projects, for a total value of $6.9 million. It is unclear how the federal government determined which projects in each state were awarded the funding and how much each state and territory would receive. The grant guidelines for the first round of funding established a project review panel, which included members of the Department of Home Affairs, other Commonwealth agencies, and the Director General of Emergency Management Australia. The panel then made recommendations to the Minister, who had the ultimate discretion to award funding. The guidelines stated that allocations will be made based on the merit of each individual application, but that consideration would also be given to the equitable distribution of funds across all states and territories. I think there are some questions that remain for the government about how they did choose projects, and which ones got in and which didn't, Mr. Watt said. The Emergency Management Minister makes the final decision on which projects to fund. At the time of the first round of funding, that was David Littleproud. Agriculture Minister David Littleproud told 7.30 in a statement, "Senator Watt knows only $50 million was available for flood mitigation because he spoke about it in his speech in the Senate and then voted for the bill." The approval of the 22 Project S was done in accordance with the EIF Act and EIF guidelines. Debate over Emergency Response Fund use. Emergency Management Minister Bridget McKenzie says the Emergency Response Fund should only be used as a fund of last resort. The Emergency Response Fund was established in 2019 with the support of Labor. It set out that a combined total of $200 million could be released from the fund each year to support initiatives designed to improve disaster resilience or provide post-disaster support. The government has not been allocating up to the maximum $200 million each year it can draw from the fund, prompting criticism from Labor that the fund is not being used for what it was designed for. Emergency Management Minister Bridget McKenzie has previously